The pain came first, sharp, immediate, undeniable. It wasn't the kind of pain that lingered or crippled, but the kind that snapped something awake inside me. A brief flash of heat, a gasp I couldn't stop, my body reacting before my mind caught up. When I looked down and saw the burn blooming red against my skin, superficial but angry, I felt something far more alarming than pain. Clarity. I stood still, heart pounding, breath uneven, staring at my own hand as if it belonged to someone else. It could have been worse. I knew that instantly. And that knowledge hit me harder than the burn itself. I had been careless, distracted, on autopilot. I had been trusting the process instead of respecting it, trusting him instead of trusting myself. As the initial adrenaline faded, a deeper realization surfaced, cold and sobering. This wasn't just about an accident. It was about how long I'd been numb. I had been moving through my life muted, softened, dulled around the edges. Letting Alec guide decisions, filter thoughts, reframe my instincts until they sounded smaller and safer. Letting him tell me what mattered, what didn't, what was too much. I told myself it was partnership. I told myself it was efficiency. But standing there with my skin burning, I finally saw it for what it was. Control. The burn forced me into my body, into the present, into myself. And once I was there, I couldn't ignore the quiet truth anymore. I had been outsourcing my judgment, emotionally and intellectually, to someone who benefited from my silence. Later, when I was alone, the room quiet and humming with nothing but my own thoughts, I replayed moments I'd brushed aside before. Alec's constant preoccupation lately, the way he guarded his screens, his sudden urgency, his distraction disguised as ambition. His sister Simone's increasing presence, hovering at the edges of conversations she didn't belong in. I had accepted all of it without resistance. That was the real shock. Not the burn, not the pain, but the realization that I had stopped protecting myself. Something hardened inside me then, not anger, not yet, but resolve. A quiet, focused determination. I would not be careless again. Not with my body, not with my mind, not with my work, and certainly not with my trust. That night, while Alex stayed late, consumed by whatever future he was building without me, I made a choice. I would look, not out of paranoia, not out of revenge, but out of self-respect. I owed myself the truth. And once you truly wake up, once the numbness breaks, you realize something terrifying and powerful. You can never go back to sleep. I didn't rush into it. That was the difference this time. Before, I would have brushed past my discomfort, told myself I was overthinking, trusted Alex's explanations without question. But the burn had stripped that reflex away. I moved slowly now, deliberately, as if every action deserved intention. The lab was quiet in that particular way it only ever was after hours, not peaceful, just emptied of witnesses. Alec had left earlier than usual, claiming he needed space to focus. I didn't question it. I didn't announce what I was about to do either. I logged onto the server with my own credentials first, letting familiarity steady me. Everything looked normal at a glance. Folders neatly arranged, projects labeled with the dull predictability of routine. And then I saw it. A new folder. It stood out immediately, not because it was flashy but because it was careful. Highly secured. Recently created. Labeled simply, Future. The word landed heavy in my chest. I hovered the cursor over it longer than necessary, listening to my own breathing. This wasn't curiosity anymore. It was instinct. The kind that whispers when something is wrong long before your mind assembles proof. I tried my credentials. Access denied. I wasn't surprised. Alec had always been meticulous about boundaries, or at least the kind that kept power on his side. For a moment, old habits tugged at me. I could still stop. I could still walk away and preserve the illusion. Instead, I thought of the burn, of how quickly things went wrong when I wasn't paying attention. I tried a password I shouldn't have remembered. Alec's old one. The screen paused for half a second, long enough to make my stomach knot, and then the folder opened. I stared at it, frozen, as the realization settled in. It worked. Not because it was clever, not because it was random, but because it was intimate, personal. Simone's birthday, Alec's sister, his confidant, his constant shadow. My hands went cold. Inside the folder wasn't chaos or secrecy. It was order.
Too much of it.
Subfolders neatly labeled. Documents aligned, organized, intentional. And none of them were what they pretended to be. This wasn't research. This wasn't planning. This was preparation. Pages of projections. Timelines. Private communications stripped of any pretense of collaboration. The future Alec had been building wasn't abstract. It was specific, deliberate, and completely absent of me. One email stopped me completely. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was casual. Efficient. We need to finalize the divorce from Reese ASAP, so he doesn't audit the financials. Jada can handle the grant paperwork until we leave. I read it again.
And again.
My name sat there so comfortably. Reduced to function. Not a partner. Not a colleague. A bridge. A placeholder. Something to step on before moving forward. The betrayal didn't arrive in a rush. It settled slowly, heavily, like a weight pressing down on my ribs. This wasn't emotional manipulation anymore. It was strategy. A financial conspiracy. A family plan. Alec and Simone hadn't just underestimated me. They had used me. And standing there, bathed in the soft hum of machines and my own steady breathing, I felt something shift again. Deeper than pain, sharper than anger. This time, it wasn't just clarity. It was resolve. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that the future they had planned would not survive the truth. I didn't close the folder right away. I sat there, unmoving, letting the information settle into my bones. The worst part wasn't the numbers or the timelines or even the blatant theft disguised as ambition. It was how calmly it had all been laid out. How long this had clearly been in motion. This wasn't a sudden lapse in ethics or desperation. It was a calculated decision, made long before I ever suspected anything was wrong. I scrolled slowly, absorbing the full scope of it. The clinic wasn't an idea. It was nearly ready. Lease discussions. Staffing outlines. Marketing strategies that spoke in confident future tense. Everything was designed with an exit in mind, and I wasn't part of it. I wasn't even an afterthought. I was infrastructure. The deeper I went, the clearer the pattern became. Alec framed every step as inevitability. Simone provided reinforcement, precision, emotional insulation. Together, they built something clean and ruthless, using my diligence as cover and my trust as leverage. I felt foolish, not weak, not naive, just painfully aware of how thoroughly I'd been compartmentalized. Alec had always praised my reliability, my attention to detail. Now I understood why. He never needed my ambition, only my consistency. I leaned back, pressing my fingers into my palm until the lingering tenderness from the burn grounded me. Pain had become a reminder, a tether. I welcomed it. It kept me present, kept me sharp. There was grief, yes, but it didn't overwhelm me. The more I uncovered, the more something else replaced it. Focus. Betrayal has a shape when you really look at it. It sharpens the edges of truth. It reveals intent with brutal clarity. And that clarity pointed in only one direction. Reese. Simone's ex-husband. I'd always respected him. Not for charm or warmth, but for something rarer. Precision without cruelty. He noticed inconsistencies others ignored. He asked questions no one else wanted answers to. Simone used to complain that he was cold, obsessive, controlling. I had always suspected she meant incorruptible. The email confirmed it. We need to finalize the divorce so he doesn't audit the financials. They were afraid of him. That told me everything. By the time I logged out of the server, my hands were steady. The fear had burned off, replaced by something cleaner. Purpose, maybe. Or simply the refusal to be manipulated any longer. I didn't confront Alec. I didn't hint. I didn't flinch when he called later, distracted and impatient, speaking to me like nothing had changed. Every word he said now sounded hollow, stripped of authority. I listened, not to believe, but to observe. Power shifts quietly when you stop giving it away. That night, I transferred copies of everything, carefully, anonymously, methodically. I labeled nothing emotionally. I didn't dramatize a single file. Truth didn't need embellishment. As I prepared the final folder, one thought repeated itself with unsettling calm. They made a plan assuming I would remain passive. They had mistaken my silence for consent. They were wrong. When I finally drafted the message to Reese, I didn't explain myself. I didn't plead. I didn't accuse. I simply wrote, "I believe you should see this." And as I sent it, I felt something click into place, the last piece of numbness falling away. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was acting. And once you choose that, there's no manipulation strong enough to pull you back. Reese replied faster than I expected. Not with disbelief. Not with indignation. Just a short acknowledgement that told me everything about the kind of man he was. He didn't react emotionally to information, he processed it. That alone steadied me. We met quietly, without urgency or drama. There was no need for secrecy, because truth doesn't panic. It waits. Sitting across from him, I noticed how unchanged he was from my memories. Composed, observant, eyes always working a second behind the conversation. He didn't interrupt as I explained how I found the folder, how Alec's password had still worked, how my name appeared in plans that excluded my consent. Reese listened the way some people dissect puzzles, patiently, methodically, without assumption. When I finished, he didn't ask how I felt. He asked what I noticed. That question alone told me I'd chosen the right ally. I walked him through the structure of the files, the language used, the timing, the deliberate distancing from oversight. I watched his expression shift subtly, not to anger, but recognition. This wasn't new behavior for Simone. This was escalation. They thought speed would protect them, he said finally, more to himself than to me. In that moment, I realized how deeply Simone had misjudged him. She'd assumed his integrity was rigidity, that his thoroughness was emotional distance. In reality, it was precision, the kind that dismantles deception without needing theatrics. Reese didn't need convincing. He'd already begun mapping the implications in his head, connecting threads faster than I could articulate them. What stunned me wasn't his competence, it was his restraint. He didn't rush to confront. He didn't suggest retaliation. He suggested audit. The word landed like gravity. An audit didn't accuse. It illuminated. It didn't argue. It documented. And suddenly, everything Alec and Simone had built looked dangerously fragile. Over the next days, Reese worked quietly, asking for specific documents, clarifications, timelines. Each request was precise, never excessive. He treated me as a collaborator, not a pawn. Where Alec had reduced me to utility, Reese restored something essential: intellectual respect. I hadn't realized how starved I'd been for that. As we pieced things together, a rhythm formed between us. Efficient.
Calm.
Grounded. There was no manipulation, no hierarchy, just alignment. He trusted my observations. I trusted his judgment. It felt stable in a way I hadn't experienced in years. And underneath that stability, something else began to surface. Not attraction in the reckless sense. Something slower.
Safer.
A quiet recognition. We were two people who valued structure not to control others, but to protect truth. When the audit formally triggered, it wasn't dramatic. No explosions. No accusations shouted across rooms. Just a process beginning, and a silence settling where confidence used to be. Alec noticed it first. His calls changed. His tone sharpened. His certainty cracked at the edges. Simone's messages stopped entirely. Neither of them knew yet, but they would. And as I watched the first real consequences unfold, I felt no guilt, only relief. The kind that comes when you finally step out of someone else's shadow and stand on solid ground. Reese looked at me once, carefully, and said, "You did the right thing." I believed him, because for the first time, I hadn't acted out of fear, loyalty, or obligation. I'd acted out of respect for myself. The shift didn't announce itself loudly. It crept in through absence. Alex stopped filling space with confidence. His usual ease fractured into something tighter, more rehearsed. Conversations grew careful, his questions indirect, as though he were circling a threat he couldn't yet see. Simone, once omnipresent, retreated completely. No messages. No check-ins. No performative warmth. Silence, I learned, is the first symptom of exposure. Reese kept me informed without overwhelming me. He never dramatized the process, never framed it as revenge. What was unfolding wasn't personal anymore, it was structural. The kind of accountability that doesn't need outrage to be effective. It simply asks for alignment between claims and reality. And reality was no longer on their side. What surprised me most was how little I wanted to confront Alec. There was no satisfaction waiting in his confession, no closure hidden in his apology. That need had evaporated the moment I realized I didn't require validation from someone who'd benefited from my doubt. Instead, I watched. I noticed the way Alec began over-explaining, volunteering reassurance I hadn't asked for. The way he mentioned future plans less frequently, as if afraid to name them aloud. The way he looked at me sometimes, searching, suspicious, uncertain whether I knew. I did. And for once, that knowledge belonged entirely to me. Meanwhile, my dynamic with Reese deepened quietly. We spent long hours reviewing material together, not in tension, but in focused cooperation. He valued efficiency, clarity, restraint, qualities I recognized in myself, but had long muted. Around him, I didn't feel the need to soften or simplify. I didn't feel managed. That alone created intimacy. Not romantic urgency. Something steadier. The kind built when two people share an axis of values rather than a narrative of attraction. We trusted each other's instincts. We respected each other's boundaries. There was no power imbalance to navigate, only alignment. One evening, as we closed another session of review, he paused longer than usual, looked at me not analytically but with something closer to recognition. "They underestimated you," he said calmly. I nodded. They always did. There was no bitterness in the exchange. Just fact. The audit findings began to solidify. Timelines matched. Projections contradicted official documentation. Funds blurred across boundaries they never should have crossed. Alec and Simone's confidence had relied on speed and assumption, the belief that no one would slow down enough to really look. Reese looked. And once you've been truly seen, you don't disappear easily. The day Alec finally asked me outright whether something was wrong, I felt almost detached. I met his concern with neutrality, answered his question without revealing anything. Watching him leave unsettled but unsatisfied felt like watching a structure crack under its own weight. I wasn't punishing him. I was withdrawing participation. And that, I realized, was the most destabilizing thing I could do. Because when you stop being useful to manipulators, when you stop buffering their risk with your silence, everything collapses faster than they expect. I slept deeply that night. Not from exhaustion, but from peace. For the first time since the burn, maybe longer, I felt protected. By my own choices. The fallout didn't arrive in flames. It came in emails, calendar cancellations, and meetings that suddenly included unfamiliar names. Auditors don't accuse, they observe. They ask questions that sound neutral, but land like pressure points. Alec tried to play calm, but his composure had developed a fracture. He smiled too long. He paused before answering things he used to recite effortlessly. Simone resurfaced briefly, sharp and defensive, only to disappear again when precision replaced persuasion. I stayed exactly where I was. Not hiding. Not advancing. Just present, grounded in the quiet authority of someone who knows the full story and no longer needs to narrate it. Reese moved with methodical confidence. Every step he took was documented, traceable, undeniable. There was no room for dramatics, and that unnerved them more than anger ever could. Simone's strategies had always relied on urgency and confusion. Alec's relied on trust and proximity. Both failed under light. As the audit unfolded, something unexpected happened inside me. Relief without triumph. I had imagined this moment might come with vindication, maybe even pleasure. Instead, what I felt was release. The knot I'd been carrying, the one that forced me to second-guess my instincts, soften my boundaries, and translate myself into something more manageable, unraveled completely. I didn't need them to fall. I needed myself back. Reese and I began meeting less formally. Not because there was less to do, but because collaboration had turned into conversation. Our discussions drifted, from logic to values, from consequence to choice. He spoke about rebuilding credibility, not just professionally, but internally. About learning to trust himself again after loving someone skilled at distortion. I recognized that terrain. There was a moment, subtle, unscripted, when we acknowledged what was forming between us. Not a declaration. Just a pause that lasted longer than utility demanded. A shared awareness that what connected us wasn't circumstance anymore. It was preference. I liked the way he never assumed access to my time or emotions. The way he waited for consent, even in conversation. That respect created a closeness that felt earned rather than extracted. When Alex's involvement became officially flagged, the atmosphere changed completely. Doors closed. Phones stopped being answered. His confidence, once expansive, folded inward. We crossed paths only once after that. His expression held confusion, maybe regret, but no accountability. I felt nothing. And that absence of reaction told me everything about how far I'd come. The final report didn't need me to testify. The evidence spoke clearly.
Cleanly.
Without embellishment. Alec and Simone had built their future on borrowed credibility and assumed silence. They miscalculated both. The day the audit concluded, Reese and I walked out into open air together. No agenda. No urgency. Just space. I don't want to replace one entanglement with another, I said quietly. He nodded. Neither do I. That understanding, mutual restraint, mutual intention, felt more intimate than any promise.
We weren't rushing toward something.
We were choosing it. And for the first time in my life, stability didn't feel like settling. It felt like truth. When everything finally went quiet, I realized how loud my life had been. Not with chaos, with compression. With the constant effort of shrinking reactions, translating concerns, softening intelligence so it wouldn't threaten the wrong person at the wrong time. Silence, when it came, felt unfamiliar. Almost suspicious. But it was clean. The audit had concluded weeks earlier, yet its impact lingered like a cleared storm. People spoke differently around me now, more carefully, more honestly. Not because I demanded it, but because I no longer offered the version of myself that absorbed other people's distortions for convenience. Reese noticed it too. He didn't comment on it directly, but there was a quiet admiration in the way he looked at me sometimes, as if he was witnessing a structure finally standing without scaffolding. Our connection deepened not through intensity, but through consistency. We met regularly, without urgency. Walks instead of meetings. Coffee instead of strategy sessions. There was an intimacy in choosing simplicity after chaos. One evening, as dusk softened the edges of the city, we sat side by side on a bench overlooking nothing remarkable, just a stretch of ordinary life moving on. People passed us, unaware of the internal revolutions that had taken place on that very bench. I used to think justice would feel louder, I said. Reese smiled faintly. I used to think peace would feel boring. We both knew now how wrong those assumptions were. Being near him felt different from anything I'd known before. There was no performance, no negotiation of power. He didn't try to impress me with certainty or control. Instead, he offered steadiness, the kind that allows space rather than occupying it. When our hands brushed accidentally, neither of us pulled away. That moment mattered not because it was charged, but because it was unforced. I felt present in my body in a way I hadn't since the accident, grounded, aware, unafraid of sensation. The memory of pain no longer ruled my caution, it informed it. I turned to him, studying the calm focus in his expression. This was a man who had survived manipulation without becoming manipulative himself, who had chosen accuracy over ego, patience over dominance. It mattered. I'm not interested in being rescued, I said softly. I know, he replied. That's why I'm here. That was the moment I understood something essential. Love, when it's healthy, doesn't arrive like a solution. It arrives like recognition. We didn't define anything that night. We didn't promise or label or accelerate. Instead, we walked, slow, aligned, toward our separate homes, carrying the same unspoken decision. Whatever this was, it would be built deliberately. Back alone, I stood in front of the mirror and saw myself clearly for the first time in years. Not hardened, not fragile, alert, intact. The burn on my skin had faded to a faint reminder, but the clarity it gave me remained sharp. I had learned that carelessness, emotional or intellectual, always costs something, and that boundaries are not walls, but instruments of survival. I slept easily that night, not because everything was resolved, but because nothing inside me was at war anymore. The morning light entered my apartment without asking permission, and for once, I didn't resent it. I lay still, breathing, aware of the quiet stability in my chest. Not relief, something deeper. Ownership. Of my time, my mind, my future. The kind of calm that doesn't come from avoiding danger, but from knowing how to face it without losing yourself. The aftermath of everything had settled into records, reports, and consequences that no longer required my attention. I had done what needed to be done. I hadn't dramatized it. I hadn't hidden from it either. I had simply refused to participate in my own erasure. That felt like victory. Reese and I didn't rush into a story that needed explaining. Instead, we created a rhythm. He became someone I trusted not because he promised safety, but because he respected my capacity to create it myself. We talked about ideas, ethics, futures, not as plans to merge, but as territories we allowed each other to walk through without ownership. There was tenderness in that restraint. One evening, weeks later, we shared dinner at my place. Nothing elaborate. No symbolism. Just honesty filling the room between us. As we cleaned up together, I realized how unfamiliar, and how right, it felt to exist alongside someone without calculating the cost. I watched him for a moment, sleeves rolled up, movements precise but unassuming. A man who understood accountability not as punishment, but as alignment. "I don't want what hurt me to define what I choose next," I said quietly. He met my gaze, serious, steady. "Then it won't." That was all. No reassurance layered with dependency. Just trust, placed carefully, received respectfully. Later, alone again, I returned to the lab bench where everything had cracked open months ago. The faint scar on my skin caught the light. I traced it once, thoughtfully. Pain had not been my enemy. Numbness had. The explosion had burned away more than carelessness. It had burned away the lie that intelligence should be softened for love, that loyalty required silence, that proximity excused exploitation. I had mistaken endurance for strength. Now I knew better. Strength was vigilance with compassion. Love was safety without diminishment. And truth was not something to be discovered, it was something to be protected. I no longer borrowed certainty from others. I built it, carefully, ethically, relentlessly, within myself. That night, as I prepared for sleep, I didn't imagine the future as a dramatic redemption arc or a flawless structure. I imagined it as something simpler and braver, a life where my mind remained my own, where intimacy never required surrender, and where partnership enhanced clarity rather than replacing it. I turned off the light, unafraid of the dark, because I finally knew what I keep: my integrity, my intelligence, my boundaries, and the quiet, steady knowledge that I will never again mistake manipulation for connection. And this time, I wasn't reborn because I was broken. I was reborn because I chose myself.